Welcome everyone to the Historic Chocolate program at the Old North Church. Today we're going to be giving a quick demonstration on how chocolate was made and consumed in the 1700s. Old North actually has quite a few connections to chocolate. Some members of the church were sea captains or sailors who were transporting chocolate across the Atlantic to city, from colony to colony. Others were merchants who were selling chocolate in their stores and shops. In the 1700s, chocolate was a really valuable trade item, and it took a lot of skill to make as well. Something that often surprises people is that eating chocolate is a relatively new thing. Biting into something like a candy bar would have been pretty unheard of in the 1700s. And that's why for thousands of years, and yes, thousands of years, chocolate was exclusively a drink, a beverage. In many ways, chocolate was a pretty different product than how we view it today. So this demonstration will help you see some of the similarities, but some of those differences as well. So chocolate comes from the cacao tree. Now during this demonstration, you'll hear me use that word a lot, cacao. Basically, cacao is the raw material that you start with, and through a lot of work, you end up with the finished product, which is chocolate. While many people in a colonial town like Boston would have enjoyed drinking chocolate, chocolate was not originally part of the European diet. We don't know the exact date, but we do know that chocolate originated in Central and South America. Indigenous and native people like the Olmecs, the Maya, and the Aztecs had made and consumed it as a beverage for hundreds of years before Europeans arrived. Chocolate was a special part of their culture. They typically preferred adding a lot of chili peppers to make it even spicier. The drink was a luxury, meaning it was something only used rarely and often for special events and ceremonies. The cacao beans were very valuable, so valuable that they could even be used as currency to buy things. When Europeans arrived in the Americas and tried chocolate, they took the indigenous practice and added their own preferences, making it much less spicy and using a few different ingredients for flavor. So we're going to make a sort of typical chocolate recipe from the 1700s while using a few of the tools that the Aztecs would have used to make it. So let's talk about this multi-step process of making chocolate. So we start with a plant called cacao. Cacao only grows in a pretty small area, basically around the equator, where the temperature and the climate are just right for it. That meant that colonists in a town like Boston couldn't grow their own cacao. They had to import all of it from the regions where it was originally grown in Central and South America. This is a cacao pod, or a replica of one, which is the fruit of the cacao tree. So technically, chocolate begins as a fruit. And these pods can grow to be about the size of an American football. Don't get too excited though. Unfortunately, chocolate isn't going to count as one of your servings of fruits and vegetables. And that's because what we are really after are the seeds, or the cacao beans, on the inside. So after the pods are harvested from the tree, they are opened and the pulp and seeds are scooped out. Then the seeds have to ferment in the sun and dry out before they can be bagged and shipped. Ferment is a complicated word, but basically bacteria help to change the cacao naturally into something that tastes better for humans. So people actually eat lots of different fermented foods, like yogurts and sauerkraut, kimchi, and even sourdough bread. When the cacao beans arrived in the colonies, they needed to be roasted to continue to dry them out and improve their flavor. But after 60 to 70 minutes of roasting, the shells would be brittle and easier to remove. We don't want the shells to get mixed up into our chocolate. This is called a winnowing basket. This is going to help us remove the shells from the cacao beans or the seeds. Typically this is going to be done outside because, as you'll see, it's a pretty messy process. As the beans are gently tossed, friction from the basket and the other seeds on the inside help the shells come off into the air. Any breeze would carry the paper-thin shells away, and the rest would settle in the bottom of the basket. And what you're left with are the now unshelled cacao beans. These shells were not entirely useless after being removed. Martha Washington, for example, made a tea out of them. Other people use them for things like mulch and fertilizer. So now that the cacao beans are shelled, you'd break these down into what are called cacao nibs. Now, these nibs are what you're going to use to make chocolate. And you take a mortar and pestle here, combine them by hand. As you crush them in the mortar and pestle, a nice chocolatey aroma starts to drift out. The flavor, though, is another story. Have you ever tried unsweetened dark chocolate or baking chocolate? The flavor of the nibs would be pretty similar to that, but way more intense and bitter. So unpleasant that they're pretty much inedible on their own. During the colonial period, to help make it taste a little less bitter and a little more pleasant, spices and flavorings were added to chocolate. So back then, every person who made chocolate would likely use their own blend of spices. But here we have just a few examples. These spices were used pretty often in the colonial era, but more flavors than just these could be used as well. So here we have some dried orange peel, which adds a little bit of a zesty taste to it. This is anise or anise. You'd recognize this flavoring in black licorice and other items like that. We also have nutmeg, and what often goes so well with nutmeg, cinnamon. This dried husk is a former vanilla bean. We're not going to add that because vanilla today is so expensive, but vanilla was another really common flavoring in chocolate back then as well. And then a tiny bit, like the indigenous people would use, of chili pepper as well to add just a touch of heat to it. Now this last one here is not sugar, but actually salt. And we're just going to add a tiny pinch of that to help accentuate the other flavors that we've just added. Now, like chocolate itself, spices like these came from all over the world. Vanilla beans from Central America, anise or anise from the Mediterranean, nutmeg from the Caribbean or from Southeast Asia. We could probably do a separate talk on the history of each one of these, but the important thing to remember is that each spice that we add is going to add a little bit of a slightly different flavor, and a person making chocolate could really be creative and make their own sort of family recipe. Now, as I mentioned all the spices here, you may have thought I'm missing a key ingredient, sugar, which is so important to modern chocolate today. It's probably the ingredient people love the most about chocolate today. But you may be surprised to know that sugar was not usually added during the manufacturing process for chocolate in the 1700s. And I'll explain why shortly. Now, what I'm using here is called a metate, and this is a mano. These tools were used in chocolate production by the Aztecs and were also brought to the colonies. The stone surface of the metate is heated. We are using a much more modern electric warming plate for this demonstration, but originally a bed of coals would have been set below to warm the metate. Now, as the mano grinds the cacao nibs down into a comparatively smoother paste, it does still have some grittiness similar to wet sand. Gradually, as we grind more and more, the crushed nibs release cocoa butter. So after grinding the chocolate nibs, you end up with chocolate paste. It's slow work using the metate and mano. They are great tools for making small amounts of chocolate, like if you were making it for yourself at home. but they are not very efficient for making large quantities of it, such as if you wanted to sell it as a business. By the mid-1700s, a visitor to a chocolate shop would be buying chocolate milled on grinding stones that were powered by horses and water. Now, once you have a nice paste, you would scrape it into a mold, kind of like the one we have down here, though it could vary in shapes and sizes at the time. And in this mold, the chocolate would harden until it dried. Now, the time it took to dry varied, but could be a pretty long time. Now, the finished dried product was what they called a chocolate cake. Something like this is what a colonist would purchase and bring home in order to prepare drinking chocolate. Now, it may look good, but remember way back in the beginning I mentioned that it was nearly impossible to eat chocolate, which is why it was a beverage, something that you would drink. Well, you wouldn't want to bite into this on the walk home from the store like you would a candy bar because it's very hard, almost like a rock. Now, you're a colonist in Boston, you've bought your chocolate cake, and you want to turn it into drinking chocolate. So how do you turn this into something that you would drink? Well, you'd grate the chocolate cake until you had enough powder for the amount of drink that you were making. You could add more if you wanted a stronger drink, or a little bit less if you wanted it weaker. Now we need to add sweetener because remember the chocolate cake itself was unsweetened. And this was actually a really smart move from the person manufacturing chocolate. When they were manufacturing it, they could save costs on sugar by not adding it at all. And then that also allowed the person buying it to sweeten it to their preferred taste. They could add a lot of sugar or a little bit or none at all themselves. In the colonial era, sugar was sold in cones like this, and you would use sugar nippers to break off pieces from the cone to add it to your chocolate. Back then, for a colonist, your packaging would probably look this rough as well. Sugar was used very sparingly back then, so a cone like this was expected to last a long time, and by the end of it would be looking like it was in pretty rough shape as well. And now it all comes together to make the drink. So here is a chocolate pot. In it you would add the grated chocolate, some sugar, and hot water. You'd bring this to a boil, mixing it up with the stirring rod or frothing stick so that everything combines and melts together into a thick, rich beverage. And it ends up so rich and thick that you would serve it in small portions in little cups called chocolate bowls, which are similar to espresso cups. Anything more than that is probably going to be too much. It's going to be too filling. So that's how they made chocolate, starting with a fruit in Central and South America and ending up a drink that was enjoyed by, say, a colonist in a town like Boston. We hope this demonstration helped you understand and appreciate all of the specialized knowledge and skill that went into making chocolate in the 1700s. But this really only scratches the surface of all there is to know on the topic. So on our website, you'll find more information about what labor practices were used and what they were like in order to grow and harvest cacao, how the transportation and trade networks across the Atlantic would have worked back then, and then how members of Old North were also involved in the chocolate trade. We hope you check out those materials, and thank you again for joining us.